Howdy, y'all. Welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today is part 3 of our deep dive, looking to identify every star fort to have ever existed on United States soil. In today's video, we will look at the largest fortress of any kind that was ever created in the United States. And this fortress just so happens to be a star or bastion fort. I will leave timestamps down below, and I can't wait to hear your comments at the end of the video. One of the most important star forts in United States history, Fort Monroe, today known as the Fort Monroe National Monument, was founded in Hampton, Virginia in 1819. Construction took nearly 15 years, but when completed, the site encompassed an area of over 560 acres within 170 historic buildings and installations. Fort Monroe is also complete with a massive moat. The Star Fort is the epitome of the bastion fort type of defensive structure that was being founded in America, and Fort Monroe was charged with protecting not only the entire Chesapeake Bay, but was also constructed to protect the Potomac River waterways, which led to Washington, D.C., and the entirety of the waterways which led to Baltimore. In such, we are told Fort Monroe was the largest fort of any kind ever built in the entire United States. We're told the fortifications on this site date back to the earliest days of the colony of Virginia, and from the foundations of these earlier forts came Fort Monroe, which was completed alongside another significant fort known as Fort Wool, built on an artificial island across the channel from Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is considered the peak of the third system of United States fortifications, which included many of the star forts on our list. The fort served as the headquarters of the harbor defenses of the Chesapeake Bay, while also housing multiple military training schools throughout the years. Fort Monroe was officially deactivated in September of 2011 by Obama and designated as a national monument. Fort Monroe, in all of its glory and beauty, still stands today. Next, we will look at Fort Ontario in the city of Oswego in Oswego County, New York. Fort Ontario is now the centerpiece of the Fort Ontario State Historic Site. The fortified site encompasses a total of 36 acres and construction was completed, we're told, in the year 1839. However, Fort Ontario is located on high ground overlooking Lake Ontario, and a first fort was said to have been built here by the French. It was constructed on land that was considered sacred to the indigenous people who once called Lake Ontario home. The first fort was founded in 1755, and this fort was home to many indigenous people, including the Iroquois. For many years, Fort Ontario was known as the Fort of the Six Nations. Remarkably, a similar fort, also possibly a bastion or star fort, known as Fort Oswego, existed across Lake Ontario. Fort Oswego was built even earlier, in 1727, by the British to blockade French trade. Fort Oswego was completely destroyed in the French and Indian War of 1756, and the foundations were then incorporated into the city of Oswego. Fort Ontario, on the other hand, was first founded in 1755, destroyed, and then rebuilt by the British in 1759. This was the location where the treaty to end Pontiac's War was signed, and the fort was destroyed again in 1778. It was rebuilt by the British in 1782 and remained in British control even years after the United States achieved independence. The British controlled this fort until 1796. The fort eventually fell into American hands and then was destroyed by the same British who built it in the year 1814 during the War of 1812. We're told this fortified site remained in ruins until 1839, when it was rebuilt as the fort which still stands today. Fort Ontario served as a medical hospital during World War I, was reopened for training during and after World War II, and also served as the only refugee center for Jewish refugees in the entire United States during World War II. Fort Ontario was restored throughout the 1950s and 1960s before being added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1970. The fort still stands today. Would you believe one of the first star forts ever built in the United States was constructed in the year 1758 and was founded in Rome, New York? This is known as Star Fort Stanwix. The epic star fort supposedly took only 4 years to complete and was charged with protecting one of the innermost trade routes of America at that time, known as the Oneida Carry. The smaller star fort encompasses only 16 acres of land, but what's remarkable is the fort that you see today is actually a rebuilt fort, simply an artistic interpretation based off analysis of the earlier foundations. We're told the first Fort Stanwix was constructed by the British to protect the trade route of Oneida, but it was sacked and destroyed, finally rebuilt by American troops prior to the War of Independence. In August of 1777, British forces intended to recapture Fort Stanwix, but eventually their massive siege was abandoned. The Star Fort was simply too difficult to capture. Star Fort Stanwix was also the site of two significant treaties, both known as the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, signed in 1768 and 1784, respectively. The current narrative tells us after 1828, Fort Stanwix was dismantled and the stones of the Star Fort were reused in nearby construction. The earthworks of the Star Fort were designated by Franklin D. Roosevelt as a national monument in the year 1935. However, the city of Rome, New York, was quite literally built on top of the foundations of the Star Fort. It took until the 1960s, but under pressure by Robert F. Kennedy, in a move not often seen in the United States of America, the Star Fort Stanwix was actually excavated, while downtown Rome, New York, built on top of the Star Fort Stanwix ruins, was systematically torn down, and the Star Fort was then rebuilt under a master plan from Kennedy and the Park Service. The plan was only approved in 1967, and the excavations of Star Fort Stanwix took until 1974. That year, the rebuilding process commenced. The rebuilt Star Fort Stanwix still stands today and is one of Upper New York's most visited historical sites. The next fort on our list is more of a myth than anything else. As we're told in the current narrative, Fort St. Andrews existed only for roughly 6 years. Yet, at the time of its completion, Fort St. Andrews was considered quite a remarkable feat of engineering and one of the finest new forts on New World soil. Fort St. Andrews was said to have been founded in 1736 by the British on Cumberland Island in Georgia. The Star Fort was considered to be a buffer between the northern occupied colonies and Spanish Florida. We're told Georgia was only officially colonized in 1732 under General James Oglethorpe. We're told the entirety of Georgia was considered a point of contention between the British and the Spanish, who both laid claim to the territory. James Oglethorpe was considered to have created at least 4 unique forts in Georgia at this time, with at least 2 of them being star forts, and Fort St. Andrews being the latter of those 2. Fort St. Andrews sat at Terrapin Point in the shape of a 4-pointed star, with inside walls roughly 65 feet in length and outer walls of roughly 130 feet in length. The fort was also palisaded and sat directly along the waterfront. By the year 1742, in the month of June, Fort St. Andrews was besieged by the Spanish, reduced to rubble, and then abandoned. Although the area was apparently reoccupied by the British, we're told the fort itself was never rebuilt, and the men in the area lived about the ruins for several years before being moved to other, more recently completed forts. With what we know, I could not find any further photographs of Fort St. Andrews. Another star fort which is seemingly barely holding on to its place in the historical narrative is a star fort known simply as the Star Fort, formerly known as Fort Alabama in Winchester, Virginia. We're told during the earliest days of the Civil War, Confederate troops began to reinforce, rebuild, and altogether construct new star forts. This is where the engineering of this particular type of architecture becomes so critical. While we almost exclusively think of star or bastion forts as a European creation, we have engineers on both sides of the American Civil War who we are told were able to construct or refurbish this particular design of fort. The Star Fort in Winchester was quite literally built on top of and within the town of Winchester. The town is thick with rolling hills that are almost indiscernible from the earthworks created for the Star Forts. There is so much history buried within this landscape, yet most of it has been allowed to become overgrown and undocumented, and finding proper photographs was very difficult. We're told a key junction of roads and railroads during the Civil War, Winchester, Virginia was also the center for nearly all banking, trade, and agriculture in the northern Shenandoah Valley. During the 1860s, Virginians built 10 forts and smaller fortified positions to block any United States Army attempts to seize Winchester. In such, we have multiple forts which may or may not have been star forts in the city of Winchester. However, we know Star Fort was, in fact, a star fort. Winchester was considered the worst, quote, war zone town during the Civil War, changing hands at least 70 times during the conflict, which is remarkable given we don't often hear this historic city mentioned in the mainstream narrative. Could Winchester have housed even more magnificent star forts which were purposefully destroyed and hidden during the Civil War? The next star fort is one that I've often heard mentioned in the mainstream, and this star fort has intrigued me since the first time that I've heard its unique name. This is Old 96 Star Fort, also known as 96 National Historic Site, and 96 Star Fort is 60 miles or 96 kilometers south of Greenville, South Carolina, although the origin of the name still remains a topic of debate. 96 was listed on the National Register in 1969. We're told the name 96 was first used to describe the distance in miles of the fort's location from the next major Cherokee town. Others propose the name derives from the indigenous people themselves, who had named it such based off the 9 tributaries of the Marion and Henley Creeks and the 6 tributaries of Thompson's Creek. Roughly 96 people lived in 96 during the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, and the first battle of the war that was fought on South Carolina soil was fought at 96 in November of 1775. We're told the British seized control of this fort, rebuilt or reconstructed the fort, and 96 was then occupied by mostly Scottish and Irish workers that were considered loyal to the British Crown. The Continental Army of the United States repeatedly attempted to besiege the Star Fort 96 from the British in the year of 1781, but the Americans failed due to the sheer size of the Bastion fort, at least according to the current narrative. 96 then remained relatively well known, but was allowed to become mostly overgrown before being cleared in the 1960s and the 1970s. Now, 96 Star Fort is one of the more popular tourist locations in South Carolina. The Star Fort 96 and the surrounding historic site encompass roughly 1,022 acres of majestic land. We have saved the best for last. In 1799, Paul I of Russia, in one of the only moves that he made without the guidance of his mother, Catherine the Great, signed a treaty formally establishing the Russian-American Company. The Russian-American Company sought the founding of star forts, establishing these forts as Russian bases for trade with the indigenous people, and to use these fortifications as locations to carry out the Russian colonization program, which involved introducing orphans to newly established Russian communities in America. Wow. The flag of the Russian-American Company was very similar to other flags that we've seen before, the double-headed eagle. During the height of the Russian-American Company, multiple large-scale forts were created on remote locations in Western America. One that still exists today, although partially in ruins, is the Russian Fort Elizabeth, also known as Pa'ulaula State Historical Site, or Fort Hippo, on the island of Kauai, in Hawaii. Star Fort Elizabeth is the last remaining Russian fortress in the entire state of Hawaii. There once were dozens. Star Fort Elizabeth once encompassed over 17 acres of land and was said to have been originally built in 1817. We're told the Russian-American Company suffered great losses, which eventually led to the company's downfall when King Kamehameha I of Hawaii united the islands. In an attempt to destabilize the Hawaiian Islands, the Russian-American Company constructed numerous forts on the island of Kauai, with Fort Elizabeth, by many accounts, being the largest and most robust. We also have Fortress Alexander and Fortress Barclay de Tolly, both built by the Russian-American Company, both of which are lost today, but each of these could have also been Star or Bastion forts. Fort Elizabeth was said to have been an irregular octagon, with walls roughly 300 to 400 feet in length, and the walls were roughly 20 feet tall. Incredible. Fort Elizabeth housed the first Orthodox Christian church on any of the Hawaiian Islands. We're told the fort fell under control of King Kamehameha by 1820, and Fort Elizabeth then remained in good condition through the 1840s, even being the location for revolts that were launched against King Kamehameha's kingdom, and later the Star Fort was used as a prison to house those who launched the revolt. The Star Fort was abandoned in 1853 and allowed to fall into disrepair. It was rediscovered, already overgrown, in 1862 when a survey was taken of the lost fort by American forces. In 1864, Star Fort Elizabeth was systematically dismantled, with the largest of the cannons actually being lost in the nearby bay. Today, the Star Fort remains just the foundations. However, you can see from these photographs just how epic and unique this star fortification really once was. I believe I'm going to wrap up my narrative on the Star Forts, part 3 right there. We've looked at a hearty collection of these Star Forts today, and bear in mind, take everything we've looked at today, everything we've read about the current narrative with a grain of salt. We're looking here at the photographs, trying to find anomalies, trying to find if the history here can really match what we are seeing in front of us. And in a great deal of these star forts founded around America, we can see that many of their foundations resemble, if not were taken, from earlier indigenous structures, mounds, and the such. And again, when we look at other parts of the world, we have most of the castles, most of the fortifications being built on mounds and tells as well. So this is just part of our history that I'm looking to peel back and uncover with you. We will be diving into the rest of the star forts that once existed in the United States of America in part 4 of this video. So stay tuned for that. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and I can't wait to hear your comments down below.